Good morning, this is Nigel Farage bringing you the latest edition of Phone Farage here on LBC. For the next 30 minutes I'll be here taking your calls. This is your chance to put any question you like to me and I'll do my best to answer. And our first caller this morning is Judy in Belsize Park. Good morning.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Farage. We've been promised a referendum in 2017, although I don't see why it can't be sooner, but there we are. If we vote to leave, how long would it actually take before we're out of the EU, and what's the procedure to unravel it all?
Okay. Yes, you're right. We have been promised a referendum. It's the referendum, of course, that Mr. Cameron never thought he'd have to deliver because nobody, himself included, thought he'd have a majority. So hooray for that. I agree with you. I'd rather not wait until the end of 2017. I'd rather do it next Thursday. But it's in the hands of the Prime Minister as he enters into the so-called renegotiation. Now, you said if we vote to leave, Judy, when we vote to leave, okay, in this referendum, we then, under the treaties we've signed, the last of them being the Lisbon Treaty, which in itself, of course, should have been put to a referendum, but never mind. Under that treaty, there is an article of the treaty, Article 50, that lays down a procedure by which we leave. We state our intention to leave the European Union. We then enter into a negotiation which may last for up to 2 years, according to the EU's rules, where we can sort out better arrangements. I don't think it would take anything like 2 years for us to negotiate a sensible free trade deal, which after all is what we want, and then we can begin the process of amicable divorce. The more difficult bit, Judy, is we have about 120,000 pages of EU law that has been transposed into British law ever since 1973. And with that, it would take us years to go through it and to find out which bits of it are basically pretty sensible, which bits of it are excessive. And I could see for the first two parliaments after we leave the European Union, the net effect of our 5-year parliaments being not governments making laws, but actually scrapping hundreds of laws.
Judy, a response?
So it will be years and years and years.
No, it won't. No, we will have this referendum. It'll happen next year, I would have thought, probably in the autumn. And there's no reason why, within 6 months of that date, we can't be out and not subject to any more EU interference, EU law or excessive costs. So, it isn't that far away. It isn't that far away.
Just before we move on, Nigel, a quick question from you before the next caller. When do you think he will actually call this referendum?
Well, I thought he'd go for it early. I thought he'd say, rather than this his premiership, and to take advantage of the fact that he's got the status quo on his side, I thought he'd have rushed it through next spring. His problem, though, is this. The referendum is based on his renegotiation. And that renegotiation is going badly. Let me give an example. The first time David Cameron discussed this renegotiation with the other leaders was in the first week of October in Brussels. It was a summit dominated clearly by the migrant crisis and all the problems, and he didn't get to speak until 1:05 in the morning. He spoke for a total of 7 minutes, during which the French president went out for a pee. Now, Put in that context, he's not doing very well, and he's now been summoned by Mr. Juncker like a naughty little schoolboy, and he's got to present his homework by November on a piece of paper to say what his renegotiation is. So he's in such trouble with that renegotiation strategy that I think next spring is, now out of the question.
It's interesting you mentioned Jean-Claude Juncker. I'm sure you, like my listeners, heard this earlier this week.
I am 150% in favour of having Britain as a constructive member state of the European Union. We need Britain. Personally, I don't think that Britain needs the European Union.
Well, Mr. Farage, you were probably present.
I was there. And when he'd finished and he got up to leave, I went up, shook his hand. I said, "Thank you, Jean-Claude. The champagne's on me." I said, "You've been enormously helpful. I've always liked you anyway."
You actually get on, don't you?
Oh, yes.
As
he's a very, very entertaining, amusing fella.
They say the same about you, Mr. Farage.
Well, probably. No, but he is. I mean, he's a guy with a sense of humour, and that's quite rare over there. So I said, and at that that moment, his chef de cabinet said, "Oh, no, that's not what Mr. Juncker said." I said, "It bloody well is. I just heard it." So they're now spinning that he didn't actually say it. I mean, it's sort of Alice in Wonderland stuff. He did say it. Thank you, Mr. Juncker. Right.
We move on to other calls.
Moving on to Daniel in Staines. Good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
Hi.
I've been a supporter of UKIP and I voted for you, but I recognise that unfortunately your image across the wider media isn't one that you'd hope for, and unfortunately you have to realise that a lot of people would find your support to be a turn-off. So my question is, how are you going to deal with that to try and get the more important aim of leaving the EU done, and not your unfortunate side effects on the possible campaign that we might go for?
Well, that's a very politically motivated question, Daniel. I don't know who wrote it down for you, but it's the sort of thing I get from snobby Tories normally, who see themselves as possibly the leading figures in this campaign. I would say this to you, that grossly unfairly, I've been the most demonised person by sections of the media in Britain since Oswald Mosley. I mean, it has been, quite frankly, some of the things that have been said and written about me over the last 2.5 years have been appalling and untrue.
Does it hurt?
I think, do you know what? To begin with, yes. To begin with, it would hurt any normal human being. After a bit, you just think, well, it's a rough old game. Ignore it.
How do you keep going?
Just by ignoring it. It's very simple. Ignore it and go for the odd pint and keep sane, you know. I mean, that's how I deal with it. But you know what, Daniel? I tell you what's really interesting is the percentage of the population that really don't like me is not particularly big. And it tends to be linked more to my policy, my genuine policy positions, than to my persona. I may not be everyone's cup of tea, but what I have done, Daniel, is I have taken a political party that was virtually unheard of, taken it to winning a national election, which has been done by no new party for over 100 years in British politics. I, with my colleagues, have managed to force a referendum, a change of national debate, I think, about Europe, immigration, grammar schools, and many other areas. And as I say, I'm not perfect, but my answer to you is this. No one individual is going to dominate the no campaign or the yes campaign. It's going to be a team effort, but I am sure that the effect of what I'm doing already, because don't forget, I'm campaigning already. I was at Sage Gateshead earlier this week doing a public meeting. I'll be down in Swansea next week, and I shall go on doing this week after week. I believe the net effect, Daniel, of what I'm doing is good for our side of the argument. But yes, it can't just be me. We need figures from the left and right of British politics out there campaigning.
And just briefly on this, I read a story earlier this week. The mayor turned rugby player in Japan. Wasn't that terrible?
Wonderful. Only he could get away with that.
I know. Any other politician would be dead in the water. Everybody just says, oh, it's Boris. How important could Boris be for the campaign? You suggested that he could be a great figurehead.
No, I didn't say great figurehead. I said he could be a great asset to the campaign, and this gets spun. You know that I want Boris to take over from the Queen. You know, I mean, it wasn't what I was suggesting for a moment. Boris, I tell you what's interesting is that politicians overrate their own recognition factor with the general public, and that's because they spend their whole lives mixing with the same group of people. You know, it's very interesting. If you take the front bench of the Conservative Party outside the great offices of state and take the front row, of Corbyn's collection of people, and
not a front bench, then it's just a collection.
Well, I thought I'd been quite polite, really. Some would say ragbag. I didn't want to do that. And if you show those photographs to members of the public, virtually no one knows even who they are. And it's true. And Boris is one of these extraordinary figures. And I remember, when my daughter, she's 10 now, but when she was 4 or 5, when Boris came on the telly, she'd point and say Boris. But he's one of these people. He's got that recognition factor. And so I think he would be an enormous addition to our side of the campaign in this referendum. And if you look at what Boris said in his conference speech, basically, he set the bar for Mr. Cameron to jump over so high that it's impossible for the Prime Minister. But basically, he said we should not have free movement of people. We must have a degree of control. And whatever Mr Cameron gets from this renegotiation, he's never, ever going to get that. The boss, the unsmiling Angela Merkel, has made it clear that that is not going to happen. So logically, Boris has now positioned himself where it's actually quite easy for him to say, well, this is what I wanted. It hasn't happened, and therefore I think it's the right thing to leave.
And he brings a vote with him, doesn't he?
And he brings a vote with him. And I mean, and here's a Conservative who managed to win in London. And London, which is now, the strongest Labour Party area in the whole of England, and yet Boris managed to win in London. So he'd be a great asset to our side. I hope it happens. I really, really do. And in some ways, that answers the question we had from Daniel in Staines. So, well, Nigel, if it's just you, yes, might you put some people off? The point is, it can't just be me. It needs to be a collection of people, but we're also going to need Labour voices and trade union voices too. And I believe that's beginning to happen. OK, moving on to Hugh in Battersea. Good morning.
Nigel, good morning.
What is your question, Hugh?
My question, Nigel, it's my father who's currently imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, awaiting the outcome of potential. It's actually 379 lashes.
Oh, God, yeah.
So you're the son of Carl... Sorry, it's Nick here. You're the son of Carl Andre, are you, Hugh?
Correct.
OK, so go ahead to Mr Farage.
Obviously, at my father's wishes, my father's old school, and whatever anyone thinks, he's got a very strong moral compass. And despite being 74, he was utterly committed to fulfil the sentence. As he said, he did a crime, and then he's prepared to do his time, and I respect him for that. But we're now looking down the barrel of month 15 for a 12-month sentence. And my question as such is, whilst I was researching over the past few months what to do and how to get the best result, obviously I came across the Transfer of Prisoners Act, which applies to individuals imprisoned abroad who have committed a similar crime that attracts a similar sentencing in this country. What can be done to change that act so that individuals who, for whatever reason, commit a crime that isn't recognised, and my father was obviously guilty of making homemade wine, etc., what could be done to bring people like him home in order to do community service or charitable work or something similar?
Well, I think the truth of it is, Hugh, and I'm obviously very, very sorry for your family's predicament. The truth is that to get a change in the legislation, the Transfer of Prisoners Act, that would take 18 months or 2 years or whatever it would take. It would not help your situation right now. However, there's nothing to stop governments doing swaps. They can do that without the need for legislation. They can do it on a bilateral basis. And I would have thought the British government should be doing their absolute best to get your father out of this prison and away from the threat of these 350 lashes or whatever it is he may potentially face. I have to say, it amazes me how little criticism there is of Saudi Arabia. As a country.
Why might that be, Mr. Farage?
Money. And big business and defence contracts and stuff like that. And people have been very scared to speak out. I mean, obviously we see the situation Hugh's father in. I mean, there are people in Saudi Arabia awaiting crucifixion. There are beheadings conducted by the state. This, all in the name of this country, who incidentally have refused to take a single one of their fellow Muslim refugees from Syria. Refused to take a single one. So I think the Saudi regime is pretty shocking, and I hear howls of protest from Corbynites about how ghastly the Americans are. Well, I'll tell you what, folks, focus a bit more on Saudi Arabia. So, Hugh, I think that's the answer to your question, is changing legislation rarely happens quickly, but the British government could, try really hard and push really hard to get him brought back home.
Just briefly, Mr. Andre, while I have you on the line, when did you last speak with your dad, and have you heard anything from the British government at all?
I personally spoke with him in January. However, I spoke with his lawyer the day before yesterday, and a letter is now being written by the British Embassy and the Prime Minister to go to the King, and they are now transferring his case from the Jeddah court to effectively the Crown Court in Mecca.
I see. And have you had contact from anyone within the government last year, Mr. Andre?
We did have an email from within the FTO saying obviously they were trying all that they could. My worry is we got a phone call from Australia the night before last from a gentleman called Peter Mutti who was arrested the same month, August last year, but the other side of Saudi Arabia. He had 24 bottles of home brew in his car. He got 6 months and was awarded 50 lashes. He too got plenty of assurances from the Australian government and the Saudi government that it wouldn't happen, and on the day he was released, he was taken outside and whipped.
Dear God. How many... Two last questions. How many bottles did your dad have, and would he survive? I understand he's quite a frail gentleman anyway.
Yeah, I think he had about half a dozen in the boot of his car, and I mean, it's really simple. It would kill him.
Listen, I know I speak on behalf of Mr. Farage. Our best wishes to you, and more power to your elbow, sir. Good luck, and if you can stay in touch with me, I'd like to hear more. But let's hope you get that away.
No, absolutely.
We must move on, Mr. Andre. Apologies, we must move on. Nigel Farage.
No, not a country I will ever visit. And just for your listeners, Nick, in case they don't know, that in the Saudi capital, women are banned from driving. They're not considered fit to drive. So there we are. We should be rather more critical, I think, of Saudi Arabia. Moving on to Robert in Balham. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Your question, Robert.
I was wondering that why Tom Watson doesn't have to apologise for the comments that he made to Lord Britain.
Well, I mean, there is a thing called parliamentary privilege, which does give our MPs the opportunity to speak in the House of Commons, to say what they think on an issue without the threat of legal action, etc. It is a very important privilege in Parliament, and not one for a moment that I would wish to see changed or rescinded. However, I think in this case, Tom Watson, having used parliamentary privilege in many ways to make a lot of fairly lurid allegations against senior Tories from the 1980s period, should perhaps this week have shown a degree of humility and contrition for what he'd done, but chose not to. And I think in doing so, I would put it to you, Robert, that actually he's damned himself. I think he's now looked upon as sort of the witch finder general. And if you thought Jeremy Corbyn was dangerous, well, just have a look at the deputy.
Boris Johnson told me it was a hysterical outburst by Mr. Watson. Is that a fair characterisation?
I think it probably was, yes. And as I say, I think he's damned himself from his own mouth. And the thing that really shocks me, I have to say, Robert, is not Tom Watson. I think what really shocks me is that months before Leon Britton, who politically I was completely opposed to, but that's got nothing to do with this, has it? I mean, months before Lord Britton died, the Metropolitan Police had decided there was no case to answer, and yet didn't tell him. And that, I think, is even more unforgivable than any hornet's nest that Tom Watson...
What should Sir Bernard Hogan be doing about that, Mr. Farage?
Going into retirement, I should have thought. I'm being serious. I mean, if you're a public figure like that, he was dying of cancer anyway, just the whole effect of that hanging over them, when before he died, he could have been told, look, we've called you in, we've interviewed you, it's pretty clear that the chap that's making these allegations is a complete fantasist. We're very sorry for what's happened, and we're going to make a public statement fully exonerating you. Think of what tremendous relief that would have given to Britain himself, but perhaps more important even than that, to his wife and broader family. So the Met have failed horribly.
So Hogan Howe really needs to apologise, or go, or both?
Well, he's got to do something, absolutely. No, absolutely.
Let's go to some emails that are coming in. This is from Jeff. Please ask Nigel Farage, how much is the VW corruption scandal a metaphor for German dominance of the European project? Wow, I think I know which side he's coming from.
Well, this club was set up so that the French and Germans could sit round the table, break bread, share wine and trade with each other as a means to stop them bashing hell out of each other, which they've been repeatedly doing for the previous 70 years, and as such was a very good idea. It was a partnership of equals up until about 3 years ago, and France has now just diminished hugely in terms of their influence in the European Union and indeed in the world. And I said last week that Hollande was a pipsqueak relative to Merkel. So yes, the Germans dominate everything. The VW scandal is a part of that, but actually there's a bigger question here. The VW scandal, what it's really about is our total obsession with carbon dioxide. We are obsessed with carbon dioxide and the emission of carbon dioxide, and it seems to me we focused on that and not on other things that are far more serious pollutants.
Lucy, you're the next call after another email. Rachel in Bexley. David Cameron has said we're finally going to hear the terms for what will be his EU reform. What does Nigel Farage think they should be?
Well, what they should be is what Dave ought to do, you know, strolling over there without his tie on, looking all terribly laid back and casual, say, sorry chaps, we want a completely different relationship. We do insist that Britain controls its own borders. We want to trade with you, cooperate with you. We will agree sensible, common, minimal standards, all sorts of, reciprocal deals for students and all those kind of things. But we really do think, actually, that the law of the land in Britain ought to be made by the British Parliament and backed up by our own Supreme Court. And if he did that and came back with that, well, we wouldn't be in the European Union anyway, would we? It would be a completely new arrangement, and that'd be great. But as it is...
So those are the two red lines then, Mr Farage, law of the land and effectively border control.
I would say they are the number... they are 1 and 2 in terms of what people would want and would then support the Prime Minister getting.
And briefly, before Lucy, I promise you're next, but the people will say, well, hold on, Mr Farage, you're not talking about the jobs that will be lost. You're not talking about the people who make cars who will no longer have work in Britain.
Well, the cars are very simple, aren't they? Lots of people invest money in Britain to build motor cars. We build more motor cars now in this country than we've ever done in our history. We sell loads of them to our own domestic market, and we sell a lot abroad. We sell more abroad outside the European Union than we sell inside the European Union.
Right?
Yep, and that figure's growing every single year. And the boss of Nissan and the boss of these big companies have already said they will go on making cars in Sunderland and elsewhere, regardless whether we're in the European Union or not. And this 40-year lie that unless you're in the European club, you can't do business with each other. I think global markets are beginning to sort of tear that down.
And when Sir Hugh Ord, who's the former chief of ACPO, Association of Chief Police Officers, says Britain could become effectively a haven for criminals because they'll come rampaging across Europe when we need the EU cooperation with European police forces. Is Sir Hugh right?
Yeah. No, he's wrong. Do you remember you and I discussed that Lithuanian convicted murderer who
Sal Carnes.
That's right, who came into Britain. We couldn't stop him coming and murdered a 14-year-old girl in southwest London. Under EU rules, we were not permitted to stop that man from coming into the country. Free of EU rules, we can stop criminals coming into Britain. We can check people that come here on work permits. And as far as cooperation goes with other police forces to deal with cross-border crime, Sir Hugh, something called Interpol was set up in 1923. It is there for police forces to cooperate. We don't need Europol, and we certainly don't need the European arrest warrant. And I defended a guy called Andrew Symeou, who was a North London lad, originally a sort of Cypriot family who'd come and settled and were working in North London, and he was under a European arrest warrant without the presentation of a single piece of prima facie evidence or a charge, chucked in to a prison in Greece for over a year and left to languish without facing charge. So people like Sir Hugh Ord ought to recognise that we are the country that actually invented and developed habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence before guilt, and our right to trial by 12 of our peers. And those things must be defended. Sorry, I got a bit worked up there.
Not at all, sir. We move on.
You've been waiting a long time, Lucy in Reigate. Hello.
Hello, love. Mr. Ferrari, I just adore your programme.
Bless you.
Mr. Farage, I love you because what you see is what you get.
Right, okay. That's very sweet of you.
I think it's just want to say. She wants to say how great we are now.
We could just say thanks, Lucy. But have you got a searching question for me, Lucy?
Yeah. What do you think about this woman from Kids Company? I understand she had a handyman, ex-prisoner, fine. He's tried to build his life up, but she moved him out of a council flat into a private apartment.
Let's move just broadly, Camilla Batman go, because some of that, of course, is unproven. But certainly and stay on the line, Lucy, I will bring you back. But the whole kids' company story, Nigel Farage.
I have to say, I've been suspicious of that woman for a very, very long time. I could never work the whole thing out. No, I really mean that.
In what way suspicious?
Something didn't ring true to me. I'm sorry, it just didn't work for me. I didn't say anything. I just thought, crikey, this is all a bit odd. There are lots and lots of people in what we could call fashionable charities. If the Prime Minister's wife thinks they're good, they're fashionable charities. And everybody throws money at them, and no one asks any questions. And even when questions were being asked about the legitimacy of Kids Company, the government chucked an extra £3 million in about 4 days before the whole thing went bankrupt. I have to say, Lucy, I thought that Bernard Jenkin yesterday did an absolutely brilliant job of cross-examining.
He's like a barrister, wasn't he?
It really was well done. And he said, were you giving them cash? Yes, no. How much money were you giving them?
Quite a bit.
And then Yentob says, Yentob from the BBC says, the whole thing's dreadful. A kid died because they weren't being given enough money to go and buy drugs. So, the whole thing stinks. The whole thing stinks. And I'm afraid, and this is true, that within the charity sector, there are quite a few charlatans. And you see a company like Kids Company where 73% of the money that was raised was paying inflated salaries of those that work for it. Okay, so I'm not against charity. I give to charity, but I'm selective about the charities that I give to. And
Lucy, thank you.
We've probably got time for one more caller, and we're going to David in Guildford.
Hello, good morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
Just one question, Nigel. You hear and read, obviously, lots of things in the press that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah, absolutely.
But can I just ask one question? I do have a vested interest in this. What's your views on the gun laws as regards making any changes to holding shotgun certificates and firearms certificates?
Well, I have to say, I think the USA gun laws are insane, and I do actually think on this Obama actually makes quite a lot of sense. I mean, the idea that you don't have to prove, who you are or have some basic background check before buying a 20-round repeating rifle strikes me as being quite extraordinary. We, on the other hand, have probably knee-jerked the other way. What happened at Dunblane was absolutely appalling, and as a result of that, we have brought in the most repressive gun laws anywhere in the world. But of course, it's very difficult to have this debate, David, because if I say to you that I think, if I was to say to you that I thought that handguns were fine if they were held by gun clubs on those premises on, very, very strict circumstances, and that it would be more sensible for the British Olympic team to be able to practice in those circumstances rather than having to go to Calais, I'd be condemned after this programme as being pro-handguns. So I'll leave that suggestion with you, that it may be an argument one could make. I'm not going to make it myself. I just can't afford the aggro.
Just before I let you go, in your home county of Kent, there will be an annex of a grammar school 10 miles up the road from Tunbridge to Sevenoaks, but it is possibly a return of grammar schools of sorts. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it's taken 5 years for this to happen, and the government effectively put the blockers on this before. They've now allowed it to go through. Sevenoaks doesn't have a grammar school, although much of the rest of Kent does, and I know a lot of parents who are very, very pleased locally, friends of ours, pleased that this is happening, regardless of whether their kids make it into that school or not.
You'd bring back grammars, I know, we've talked about this in the past.
I mean, there is this argument, only the elite go to grammar schools because they buy expensive houses near the grammar schools. Yeah, well, if you build grammar schools in poor areas too, that won't apply. It's worth thinking about. We abolished over 1,000 grammar schools. And when you think that we lived through a period of time where our prime ministers, the Heaths,
yes, John Major,
the Thatchers, the Majors, these people went to grammar schools and reached the top, across the whole of our society. And now what we have are the 7% whose parents are well off enough to send them to our private schools, public schools, which are excellent, but the 7% who can afford it, those children now have bigger advantages in their life than at any time in the past. And I was looking the other day at this. The 6 leading independent schools have more pupils at Oxford and Cambridge University this year than the 2,000 lowest producing comprehensives. Does that mean that in poor parts of Britain, working class kids don't have the IQ necessary? Or does it mean that those kids with high IQs are not being given the opportunity? And I'm pretty certain that it's the latter. And I think if we believe in social mobility, and if we want a meritocracy, we have to give every kid who's bright a chance to do their absolute best. And I would bring back not one annex grammar school, but a grammar school in every town.
And lastly, we finish as we started. A quick word on Europe. The plans to allow Turkish nationals to get visas to this. Oh dear, literally, Mr. Farage's head is in his hands. Still in his hands, by the way, to travel to Europe in return for Ankara's help in stemming the flow of the refugees and migrants.
Well, let's try insane, shall we? So what we're going to do is say to 75 million people incidentally much poorer in most cases than those that have even come from Romania or Bulgaria, you can all come to Europe. There's no need to show a visa whatsoever. I mean, haven't we had enough problems already internally within the European Union with the free flow of people from poor to rich countries? It's mad, and they're bribing them with 3 billion to help to help the people in the camps, to try and stop them coming. There's no evidence that will work, but this is all a precursor to Turkey joining the European Union. So listen, folks, if you want Turkey to join the European Union, if you think another 75 million poor people should have access to come to Britain, to use the health service, to use our primary schools, to take jobs in whatever sector it may be, if you think it's a good idea for our political borders now to reach Iraq and Syria, then please vote to stay inside the European Union, because that is what is coming down the tracks at you.
That's it for this week's episode of Phone Farage with Nigel Farage here on LBC. When you